Ridgewood Heights was a picturesque suburb with tree-lined streets and houses that seemed to smile under the sunlight. Every morning, the neighborhood buzzed with familiar sights. Mothers chatting by the mailbox, children playing hopscotch on the sidewalks, and friendly waves exchanged between those who had lived side by side for years. But beneath the warmth of those familiar greetings, there were whispers, unspoken tensions that simmered just out of sight. Henry Johnson was a man who kept to himself. His house, with its neatly trimmed lawn and perfectly painted fence, was the image of order, but Henry's scowl was often seen from behind his front window. A retired man in his late 60s, Henry was known for his gruff demeanor and rigid views. He had lived alone for years, and whenever he spoke, it was usually to grumble about something he didn't like, particularly the changes in the neighborhood he'd grown up in. To many, Henry's prejudice was no secret. Though he rarely spoke directly, his looks and occasional offhand comments were enough to make his feelings known. Next door lived Jamal Turner, a 17-year-old with a wide smile and bright, curious eyes. Jamal lived with his mother, Denise, who worked long hours at a local clinic. Despite her busy schedule, she had raised Jamal to be kind, respectful, and hardworking. He spent his weekends mowing lawns, painting fences, and running errands for neighbors, earning a bit of money to help his mom. Everyone in Ridgewood Heights knew Jamal, and most appreciated his polite and helpful nature. But there were always a few who viewed him through a different lens, like Henry. Every time Jamal passed Henry's house, he would offer a nod or a quick "Good morning, Mr. Johnson." Sometimes, Henry would grunt in reply, but more often than not, he would just pretend not to hear. For Jamal, this was nothing new. He had learned to navigate around Henry's icy demeanor. He did not expect much from the old man, and even though he felt the sting of those cold, judgmental stares, he chose to remain polite. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet storm brewing, one that would soon break through the tranquility of Ridgewood Heights and shake its residents to the core. The sun was starting to dip below the rooftops, casting a warm, golden glow over Ridgewood Heights. Jamal was walking home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, when he noticed something strange. Mr. Johnson was in his front yard, struggling to repair a loose board on his fence. Normally, Henry would never let anyone see him looking weak or tired, but today he seemed different, his movements slow and his face flushed. As Jamal approached, he saw it happen. Henry's hand suddenly clutched at his chest, and he staggered, the hammer slipping from his grip. For a moment, it was as if time froze. The neighborhood was silent, with not a single car passing by. Then Henry collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground. Jamal's heart leapt into his throat. Without thinking, he dropped his backpack and sprinted across the yard. "Mr. Johnson!" he shouted, kneeling down beside the older man. Henry's eyes were half closed, his breath shallow and ragged. Jamal could see the pain etched across his face, and for a moment, he was unsure what to do. But panic wasn't an option. He quickly pulled out his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. "This is Jamal Turner. I'm at 456 Pine Street. My neighbor just collapsed. I think he's having a heart attack," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Please hurry." While he waited for the ambulance, Jamal did everything he could to help. He remembered the basic first aid his school coach had taught him and began administering CPR, his hands pressing rhythmically on Henry's chest. As he worked, he kept talking to Henry, hoping that the sound of his voice would keep him conscious. "Stay with me, Mr. Johnson. Help's on the way. Just hold on." Minutes later, which felt like an eternity, the blaring sirens of an ambulance echoed down the street. Paramedics rushed out, quickly taking over from Jamal. They moved efficiently, checking Henry's vitals, placing an oxygen mask over his face, and loading him onto a stretcher. As they lifted him into the ambulance, one of them turned to Jamal, his expression serious but grateful. "You did a good job, kid. If you hadn't been there, he might not have made it." Jamal stood there, watching the ambulance drive away, the red and blue lights flickering in the growing twilight. His hands were still trembling, and he realized he had been holding his breath. As the ambulance disappeared around the corner, a few neighbors who had been watching from their windows began to emerge. They murmured amongst themselves, a mix of shock and relief in their eyes. But Jamal wasn't thinking about their reactions. He was just glad he had been able to help, even if it was someone who had never been kind to him. For Jamal, it didn't matter who Henry was. All he could think about was that a human life was at stake, and he had done what he could to save it. Henry spent several days in the hospital, recovering from the heart attack that had nearly taken his life. During this time, Ridgewood Heights buzzed with the story of how Jamal had saved him. Some neighbors were genuinely impressed, admiring the bravery and quick thinking of the young man who had acted without hesitation. Conversations on porches and in grocery store aisles often included words like heroic and selfless when they spoke of Jamal. Yet, as warm as these compliments were, there was an undercurrent, a whispering tension that slowly grew louder. At first, the rumors were just faint echoes, barely audible beneath the surface of polite conversation. "Did you hear that Henry said some things were missing?" someone murmured at the local coffee shop. It was the kind of remark that, at first, seemed too outlandish to be true, easily dismissed as gossip. But like wildfire, it spread, catching onto people's fears and biases. Those who had seen Jamal near Henry's house when he collapsed began to speculate, their words tinged with suspicion. He was in the house, wasn't he? Maybe he saw an opportunity. The insinuations slithered through the neighborhood like a snake, winding their way into nearly every conversation, infecting the way people viewed Jamal. For some, it was easier to believe the worst. They had always viewed him with a cautious distance, an unspoken but palpable barrier built on prejudice. The image of Jamal saving Henry's life was overshadowed by something darker, an unfounded suspicion that he might have used the situation to his advantage. When Henry finally returned home, frail and exhausted, he hoped to find solace in the familiarity of his house. Instead, he was greeted not with sympathy, but with subtle, probing questions. Neighbors who had been eager to check on his well-being soon diverted the conversation. "So glad you're okay, Henry," they would say, their smiles faltering. "But I heard, well, you know that something might have been stolen?" At first, Henry was confused. He hadn't noticed anything missing, and the thought of being robbed had never crossed his mind. But the more people talked, the more the idea took root. It was like a seed planted in his mind, growing thorny vines of doubt. Henry's feelings became tangled: anger at the thought of being deceived, fear of appearing weak, and pride that stubbornly resisted the possibility that he had been vulnerable, especially around someone he harbored biases against. In the quiet of his home, those doubts festered, poisoning his thoughts until he could almost convince himself that Jamal had taken advantage of him. The day he returned from the hospital, Jamal was out mowing another neighbor's lawn. The rhythmic hum of the mower filled the street, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Henry's mind. As Henry's car slowly pulled into the driveway, Jamal paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He offered a nod, a polite smile that quickly faded when he saw the look on Henry's face. Henry stepped out of the car, his eyes fixed on Jamal with a cold, accusatory glare. For a moment, he just stood there, his fingers gripping his cane, the air around him thick with unspoken words. Then, without warning, he marched across the yard, his cane tapping furiously on the pavement, each step echoing his pent-up frustration. "Boy," Henry's voice was sharp, cutting through the serene afternoon like a knife. Jamal looked up, confused, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Henry's face twisted with anger, his eyes dark with accusation. "What are you talking about, Mr. Johnson?" Jamal stammered, his mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. "Don't play dumb with me." Henry's voice grew louder, and suddenly, curious eyes peeked out from behind curtains, blinds slightly lifted. It was as if the entire neighborhood held its breath, drawn by the commotion. "I know what you did. Everyone knows. You took something from my house while I was helpless." Jamal's eyes widened, shock washing over his face. The accusation hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. He felt a wave of disbelief, then a crushing sadness, as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. "I didn't take anything," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I was just trying to help you." Henry's hand trembled as he pointed a finger at Jamal, his face flushed with rage. But beneath the anger, there was something else, an edge of shame, of fear, though he would never admit it. "You're a liar," he spat, his words harsh and unforgiving. "I should have known better than to trust someone like you." A tense silence fell over Ridgewood Heights, heavy and suffocating. The hum of the lawn mower had stopped, replaced by a stillness that seemed to amplify every word, every breath. Neighbors who had been too curious to look away now stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or just watch from a safe distance. Some turned their heads, not wanting to meet Jamal's eyes, while others whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of doubt and discomfort. It was as if they had all been given permission to believe the worst. Jamal's hands trembled, his vision blurring with tears he desperately fought to hold back. He had always been taught to be respectful, to rise above the ignorance of others. But in that moment, he felt raw and exposed, every word cutting deeper than the last. "Mr. Johnson, I swear, I didn't take anything," he said, his voice cracking. But he could see it in Henry's eyes. He had already made up his mind. No amount of pleading would change that. That evening, the situation escalated further when two police officers arrived at Jamal's door. They wore polite smiles, but their questions were precise, probing. Jamal answered each one as calmly as he could, but inside, he was shaking. He had never been in trouble before, never even been questioned by the police, and now he was being treated like a suspect. His mother, Denise, stood beside him, her face a mask of quiet strength, but Jamal could feel her hand on his shoulder, firm and steady, as if anchoring him to the ground, silently telling him, "I'm here. We'll get through this." When the officers left, promising to continue their investigation, Jamal sat down on the porch steps, his head in his hands. The world around him felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had always tried to do the right thing, to be the kind of person who helped others, no matter what. But now, it felt like the world was punishing him for it. He looked up at the darkening sky, the stars beginning to peek through the twilight, and felt a heaviness settle in his chest. It wasn't just the pain of being accused, it was the realization that, despite everything he had done, despite the person he had tried to be, people still saw him as something he wasn't. And maybe, he thought bitterly, they always would. The accusation against Jamal cast a long, dark shadow over Ridgewood Heights. It was as if a cold wind had swept through the neighborhood, chilling the warmth that once defined the community. In every corner of the suburb, the story of Jamal and Henry became the subject of intense debate, spreading like a storm cloud over the quiet streets. People gathered in small clusters on porches, at the grocery store, and by the park, whispering and exchanging suspicious glances. What had once been a peaceful, predictable suburb was now buzzing with tension, invisible lines drawing clear divisions between residents who had lived side by side for years. Mrs. Parker, a kind woman who had known Jamal since he was a little boy, was one of the few who spoke up for him without hesitation. She was not easily swayed by rumors. "I've seen that boy grow up," she told anyone who would listen. "He's the first to lend a hand, whether it's mowing your lawn or carrying your groceries. If he says he didn't take anything, then I believe him." Her words were met with nods of agreement from some, a flicker of relief in their eyes as if they, too, wanted to believe in Jamal's innocence. But there were also skeptical frowns, those who listened with crossed arms and averted gazes, their minds already made up. Mr. Simmons, on the other hand, found a new audience for his suspicions. He had always been quick to judge, and now he had the perfect stage to voice his doubts. "I'm not saying he did it, but you can't deny it's strange, isn't it?" he would say, his voice carrying across the room at the local cafe. "The old man's lying there, helpless, and next thing you know, things are missing. Makes you wonder." He let his voice trail off, his expression carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. He didn't need to say the words directly. The seed of doubt had already been planted, and it grew in the fertile ground of prejudice and fear. The once close-knit community began to fracture. Longtime friends now found themselves on opposite sides of the argument, their conversations tinged with unspoken tension. It was no longer just about Jamal and Henry. It was about who they chose to believe and why. For some, it was a matter of principle. They stood by Jamal, citing his history of kindness and integrity. For others, swayed by old prejudices or simple fear of the unknown, it was easier to side with Henry's accusation. There was comfort in the familiar narrative of distrust, even if it meant turning against someone they had known for years. In the midst of all this, there was Martha Reynolds, known around the neighborhood for her curiosity. Some might even call it nosiness. Martha had a sharp eye for details and a knack for uncovering the truth. She had been friends with Henry for decades, one of the few who could get past his gruff exterior. When she heard about the accusation, she was as shocked as anyone. At first, she assumed Henry must be telling the truth. After all, she had known him for so long, and he wasn't one to lie. But as the days passed, Martha couldn't ignore the nagging doubt that crept into her mind. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with her, and she was determined to find out why. Martha had always been a keen observer. She noticed the subtle shifts in the way people spoke about Jamal, the way his name was no longer said with warmth, but with a caution that bordered on distrust. She watched his neighbors, who once waved to him with smiles, now avoided his gaze, their faces clouded with uncertainty. One evening, after overhearing yet another heated discussion about Jamal at the local grocery store, she decided she needed to see for herself. If there was more to this story, she was going to find it. Her investigation began with quiet observations, her sharp eyes scanning the neighborhood for anything unusual. And that's when she remembered. A few days before Henry's heart attack, she had seen an unfamiliar man leaving Henry's house. It wasn't just the man's presence that struck her. It was the way he had looked, glancing around nervously, almost as if he was making sure no one was watching. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Now, in light of everything that had happened, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what Henry was letting on. Martha's curiosity was piqued. She started asking questions, but subtly, so as not to raise suspicion. She had a way of making casual conversation sound innocent, even when she was gathering information. She began with Mrs. Taylor, who lived across the street from Henry and was known for her sharp memory. "Did you happen to see anyone visiting Henry last week?" Martha asked, keeping her tone light. "I thought I saw someone, but maybe I'm just imagining things." Mrs. Taylor nodded, her eyes widening slightly. "Oh, yes, I did see someone. It was a man, older, kind of scruffy looking. I remember thinking it was odd because Henry doesn't usually have visitors, you know?" She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And he left in a hurry, too, like he was trying to get away before anyone noticed." Armed with this new information, Martha continued her quiet investigation, piecing together bits of information from different neighbors. She learned that the man's name was Frank, an old acquaintance of Henry's from years ago. He had shown up unexpectedly, and Henry, though surprised, had let him stay for a while. Some said they had seen Frank and Henry arguing the day before Henry's heart attack, their voices raised enough to be heard through the open windows. It was a small detail, but one that seemed to add another layer to the already complicated story. The more Martha learned, the more her doubts grew. She found herself questioning not just Henry's story, but her own assumptions. She had always thought of Henry as a stubborn but honest man, yet here she was, faced with the possibility that he had let his pride and fear cloud his judgment. It was a sobering thought, one that weighed heavily on her as she prepared to confront him. One afternoon, Martha decided it was time. She brought a fresh batch of her famous apple pie, hoping it would soften him up, but her visit was anything but casual this time. As they sat down at Henry's kitchen table, the air between them felt heavy, almost suffocating. Martha took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. She had always been a straight talker, and she wasn't going to stop now. "Henry," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. I know you've been through a lot, but this situation with Jamal, something doesn't add up." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I heard that your friend Frank was here last week, and I heard you two had a bit of a disagreement. Is there anything you're not telling us?" Henry stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "What are you getting at, Martha?" he said, his tone defensive. "I've already told the police everything I know." "I'm not accusing you of anything," Martha replied, holding his gaze. "I'm just trying to understand. Because if Jamal is innocent, then that means someone else is responsible, and I don't think it's right to let an innocent boy suffer for it." Henry's face flushed, a mix of anger and something else. Shame, perhaps, or fear. "Frank didn't take anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I don't want to talk about this." Martha's heart sank, but she pressed on, her eyes never leaving his. "Henry, please. You know Jamal didn't do this. If there's something you're not saying because you're embarrassed or afraid, it's not worth destroying a young man's life over. You have to tell the truth, even if it's hard." Henry's hands shook slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. For a moment, Martha thought he would explode in anger, but then she saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, as if the wall he had built around himself was beginning to crack. I didn't want anyone to know," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Frank came by asking for money, and when I said no, he got angry. I didn't think he'd take anything, but after he left, I noticed a few things were missing." Martha's heart pounded. This was it, the truth she had been searching for. "Then why didn't you say something? Why accuse Jamal?" Henry looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't know," he muttered. "I was scared, I guess. Scared of looking like a fool, letting someone take advantage of me. And I don't know, it was easier to blame him." Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She felt a mix of sadness and relief, knowing that the truth was finally starting to come out. "Henry, you need to make this right," she said softly. "For Jamal, for yourself, and for this neighborhood. It's not too late." Henry didn't respond, but his shoulders slumped, as if a heavy burden had been placed on them. Martha left his house that evening, her steps slow and thoughtful, hoping that her words had reached him. As she walked down the street, she saw Jamal standing in his front yard, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. The fight wasn't over yet, but she wasn't going to stop until the truth was brought to light. Things are starting to unravel, but will Henry find the courage to make things right? If you're moved by this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales of truth and redemption. Don't miss the next chapter. Martha's words lingered with Henry long after she left his house. As he sat alone in his quiet living room, he replayed the conversation in his mind. He knew she was right, but admitting it out loud was something he hadn't been able to bring himself to do. The next morning, as the sun slowly crept over Ridgewood Heights, Henry made a decision. One that would either bring relief or deepen his shame. Meanwhile, Martha had not been idle. Determined to see justice done, she took it upon herself to visit the local police station. She spoke with the officer who had been handling Jamal's case, explaining what she had learned about Frank. She urged them to investigate further, to look beyond the assumptions that had been made, and to find out the truth. The officer agreed to follow up, but there was still no clear resolution. The weight of the accusations continued to hang over Jamal like a dark cloud. Later that day, a new buzz swept through the neighborhood when a police car parked in front of Henry's house. People peered through their windows, curious and nervous, whispering among themselves as two officers walked up to Henry's door. Jamal, who had been sitting on his porch trying to distract himself with homework, noticed the commotion. He felt his heart tighten, a sense of dread washing over him. What now? Inside the house, Henry greeted the officers with a stiff nod, his face pale and drawn. He knew what they had come for, and he had already decided what he was going to do. As they began to ask him questions, Henry hesitated for just a moment, the words catching in his throat. But then he remembered the look on Jamal's face that day, the shock, the pain, and he forced himself to speak. "I need to tell you the truth," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The officers listened as Henry recounted the visit from Frank. He explained how his old friend had shown up out of the blue, asking for money, and how they had argued when Henry refused. "I thought that was the end of it," Henry said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "But after he left, I noticed a few things were missing. I didn't want to believe it that Frank could do something like that." He paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. "When the rumors about Jamal started, I let people believe it because it was easier. I didn't want anyone to know that I'd been taken advantage of." One of the officers, Officer Blake, nodded and made notes, his expression serious. Mr. Johnson, do you understand that by not telling us this sooner, you've allowed an innocent person to be accused? Henry nodded, unable to speak, his face crumpling with guilt. We'll need to investigate further, but thank you for coming forward. As the police car pulled away from Henry's house, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. News spread quickly. Henry had admitted the truth. Martha's relentless pursuit of answers had paid off, and the scales were finally tipping in Jamal's favor. But for Jamal, the ordeal wasn't over yet. He still had to face the whispers, the judgmental stares, and the painful memory of being accused by someone he had tried to help. That evening, Henry made his way to Jamal's house. His walk was slow, and he leaned heavily on his cane, each step filled with hesitation. When he reached the door, he saw Denise, Jamal's mother, standing on the porch. She had heard the news, but there was no relief in her eyes, only a guarded, weary look. She didn't say anything as Henry approached, just waited, her arms crossed. "I need to speak with Jamal," Henry said, his voice cracking. Denise hesitated, then nodded and called for her son. Jamal appeared at the doorway, his expression wary but calm. He had been through too much to expect anything anymore, least of all an apology from Henry. "Jamal," Henry began, his voice barely steady. "I've done a terrible thing. I was wrong to accuse you, and I am so sorry." He looked up, meeting Jamal's eyes for the first time, and Jamal could see the tears brimming there. "I let my pride and my prejudice blind me, and you paid the price for it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry." For a moment, there was silence. Jamal's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to lash out, to demand why Henry hadn't spoken up sooner, why he had let him suffer. But as he looked at the old man, frail and broken, something softened inside him. Jamal had always been taught to lead with empathy, and now, standing face to face with the man who had wronged him, he found himself struggling with a mix of emotions. "Mr. Johnson," he said slowly, "I'm glad you told the truth, but do you know how hard this has been for me? For my mom? People I thought I could trust, people who knew me, looked at me like I was a criminal, and all because I tried to help you." His voice trembled, but he kept going. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I just want you to understand how much damage words can do." Henry nodded, his tears now streaming down his cheeks. "I do, Jamal, and I'm sorry. I can't take back what I did, but I want to make it right however I can." The next day, Henry called a meeting at the local community center. It was a small, modest building where neighborhood events and gatherings were held. He had asked Martha to help spread the word, and by early evening, the place was filled with residents, all murmuring with curiosity. Some had come out of a sense of support for Jamal, others out of sheer curiosity, eager to see what Henry had to say. Henry stood at the front of the room, feeling more vulnerable than he had ever felt in his life. The crowd quieted down, and all eyes turned to him. For a moment, he considered turning around and walking away, but he forced himself to stay. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice echoing in the room. "I called this meeting because I need to set things right." He told them everything about Frank's visit, the argument, and how he had allowed his pride to lead to an unjust accusation against Jamal. "I let my fear and my stubbornness get in the way of doing the right thing," he said, his voice breaking. "And I accused a young man of something he didn't do. Jamal saved my life, and I repaid him with distrust. I can't change what's happened, but I can at least tell the truth." The room was silent as Henry finished, and then, one by one, people began to clap. Some clapped because they were relieved that the truth had come out, others because they respected the courage it took to admit such a grave mistake. But in the back of the room, Jamal stood quietly, his eyes locked on Henry. He could see how much it had cost the old man to stand there and speak those words. As people began to disperse, Henry slowly approached Jamal. "I understand if you can't forgive me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But thank you for giving me the chance to apologize." Jamal looked at Henry for a long moment before he spoke. "I accept your apology, Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But forgiveness, that's going to take time." He extended his hand, and Henry shook it, a small but significant gesture of reconciliation. In the days following Henry's public confession, a sense of calm began to return to Ridgewood Heights, but it wasn't quite the same neighborhood it had been before. The scandal had exposed cracks in the community, forcing people to confront the prejudices and fears that had been lurking just beneath the surface. For some, it was an uncomfortable awakening. For others, a reminder of the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Jamal had been relieved when Henry admitted the truth, but the wounds from the ordeal didn't heal overnight. He still felt the sting of betrayal from the people he had trusted, and although the whispers had mostly stopped, the memory of those judgmental stares lingered. He continued to go about his days, helping neighbors and studying for school, but there was a quiet, wary distance in his demeanor now, as if he was trying to protect himself from being hurt again. One afternoon, as Jamal was returning home from school, he noticed a familiar figure standing near his porch. It was Henry, leaning on his cane, looking more frail than ever, but with a determined expression on his face. Jamal hesitated, unsure of what to expect. He had already heard Henry's apology. What more could there be to say? "Jamal," Henry called out, his voice soft but resolute. "Could I have a word with you? I promise I won't take up much of your time." Jamal approached, nodding. "Sure, Mr. Johnson." Henry took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since all this happened. I realized how much I owe you, not just for saving my life, but for opening my eyes. I've lived a long time, Jamal, but I've never been as ashamed as I've been these past few weeks." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I want to make things right, not just with you, but with the whole neighborhood." Jamal didn't respond immediately, letting Henry's words sink in. "I appreciate that, Mr. Johnson," he said finally. "But like I said before, forgiveness takes time." "I understand," Henry said, nodding, "and I know I have no right to ask for it. But I want to do something meaningful, something to show that I'm serious about changing. So, I've been talking to some people at the community center, and we're going to set up a neighborhood scholarship fund for kids like you who have bright futures but need a little extra help. I'd like to name it after you, if you'll allow it." Jamal blinked, taken aback. "A scholarship? But why?" "Because I want to do something good," Henry said, his voice cracking slightly. "Something that might make up for all the harm I've done. And because I see now what I should have seen all along, that you're a bright, decent young man, and you deserve every opportunity. If my actions can help you and others get a better start, then maybe that's a step toward redemption." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this, hadn't even dared to hope for something like it. "Mr. Johnson, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Henry replied, a small, sad smile on his lips. "Just think about it. I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm willing to try. And if this can help even a little, then it'll be worth it." The scholarship fund was announced the following week, and it quickly became the talk of the neighborhood. Many were surprised, some were skeptical, but most were genuinely touched. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what it symbolized, a gesture of reconciliation, a sign that change was possible, even in the most stubborn of hearts. Henry's efforts didn't end there. He began volunteering at the community center, helping out with events and workshops. He even took part in a new program designed to address the very issues of prejudice and misunderstanding that had torn the neighborhood apart. It wasn't easy for him. Every time he stood in front of a group to talk, he felt the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. But he was determined to do better, even if it meant confronting the parts of himself he had tried to ignore for so long. The neighborhood started to change, too. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening out in the open. People began to ask themselves hard questions about their own biases, and small but significant acts of kindness became more common. Mrs. Parker organized a community potluck, inviting everyone to bring a dish and share a meal. Jamal attended, hesitantly at first, but found himself surrounded by people who were genuinely happy to see him. One by one, neighbors came up to him, offering words of support and apologies for doubting him. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Jamal knew that not everyone had truly changed, and there would always be some who clung to their prejudices. But it was a start, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a glimmer of hope. The evening was winding down when Henry approached Jamal, carrying 2 cups of lemonade. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, and Jamal nodded, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the rooftops. "You know," Henry said after a moment, "I never thought I'd see the day when this old neighborhood would come together like this. It's a nice sight, isn't it?" "Yeah, it is," Jamal agreed, a soft smile on his face. "I guess people just needed a reason to see each other differently." Henry nodded. "And I needed a reason to change. I'm grateful for that, even if it took me longer than it should have." He looked at Jamal, his eyes earnest. "I still have a lot of work to do, but I'm trying. And I hope one day you'll be able to forgive me." Jamal looked at Henry, seeing not the stubborn, prejudiced man who had once accused him, but someone who was making a sincere effort to be better. It wouldn't erase the pain, but it was enough to build something new. "I think we're getting there, Mr. Johnson," he said, little by little. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Henry and Jamal sat side by side, 2 people who had once been separated by fear and prejudice but who were now, against all odds, finding a way to bridge that gap. It was a small, imperfect step, but it was real, and sometimes that was enough. The Jamal Turner Scholarship Fund became a permanent fixture in Ridgewood Heights, supporting local students who showed promise and determination, much like Jamal himself. Over the years, it helped dozens of young people pursue their dreams, and every year, Jamal would attend the ceremony, quietly proud of what his courage and kindness had helped create. As for Henry, he continued to volunteer and remained an active part of the community center. He was no longer just the grumpy old man with a scowl, but had become someone who sought to learn from his mistakes and do better. People still spoke of the scandal, but over time, it became less a story of prejudice and more one of redemption, a reminder that change was always possible, no matter how late it came. Thank you for watching this powerful story of redemption and change. If you were inspired by Jamal's courage and Henry's journey, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge prejudice and celebrate resilience. Share this video to spread the message that it's never too late to make things right.